I wanted to start by just acknowledging the fact that I'm not a lawyer, but I'm drawing on the work of a range of lawyers at the Children's Institute. That includes Prince Lean Mahiri, Stephanie Raw, Sasha Stevenson from Section 27, and Anne Skelton from the Centre of Child Law. I've chosen to start with this rather disturbing picture. It's the fence or wall that defines the barrier between Mexico and America. And I just wanted to put this discussion in a global context, because I think we're looking at a situation where increasingly we're looking at streams of refugees escaping either violent conflict or climate change catastrophes. And we're looking at a world where we are intent on walling people out. And I think we really need to look quite closely at ourselves and at one another, and to establish our common humanity. This particular image comes from the Syrian conflict, refugees at the Turkish border. The second image highlights concerns around children within these kind of humanitarian crises. We also need to think quite carefully about the language that we use. When we're talking about refugees seeking refuge, seeking protection, but also looking at migrants who bring with them resources that can help enrich and build our own country. So real request at the heart of it all to recognize that refugees are human beings, and very much like ourselves. So for me, it's of particular concern that we're seeing these same trends, these same rise of xenophobia, discrimination occurring within the South African healthcare system. And it's really important for us all to be aware of the extent of foreign children's rights to healthcare services. I thought it might be useful to just reassure you with some of the numbers. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence coming out when talking to clinicians that clinics are now overrun with foreigners, to the detriment of South African citizens. We have, in the 2011 census, about 2.2 million foreign nationals in the country. Not all of those are refugees, many of them are permanent residents. So we're looking at about 3.3% of the population, and this is well within the global norm. So we're not exceptional in any way. If we look at the Constitution, this safeguards our rights to healthcare services. In Section 27, turn this so I can see things at the same time. In fact, maybe I can do this with my glasses on, if you'll excuse me. Section 27, 1A, outlines the entitlement of everyone to the right to access healthcare services, including reproductive health care, together with the right not to be refused emergency care. Whereas Section 28 outlines children's rights within the Constitution, and there children have a far more direct right to basic healthcare services. So whilst the rights in Section 27 are subject to progressive realisation within available resources, children's right to healthcare is much more direct. When we try and interpret what these rights mean in South African law, it's very important to look to international law for guidance. That includes the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the African Charter. And there's 4 key principles that should guide our decision-making in relation to any child. This includes the right to survival and development, the best interest of the child, which should be considered of paramount importance in any decision-making, the right to participate in decision-making processes, that's the right of the child, and above all else, the right to non-discrimination. Non-discrimination is defined more closely within the UNCRC, and that prohibits discrimination on the basis of the child, parent or legal guardian's race, national, ethnic, or social origin. This also includes the child's status as an unaccompanied, separated child or a refugee, asylum seeker, or migrant. In addition, the UNCRC provides for special protection for refugee children, and that includes humanitarian assistance and enjoyment of all the rights that are set out in international law. So there's a very clear basis being outlined internationally around the right to equality, and that is reiterated in our own constitution, where the state may not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one or more grounds, including ethnic or social origin. One of the key challenges we face in South Africa, as said earlier, is how do we define basic healthcare services for children? It was a question that Tony Westwood and Maylene Shunking tried to grapple with in the 2010 issue of the Child Gauge, and they came up with a number of suggestions of what could go into an essential package. And it's important to recognize that that essential package extends beyond pregnancy and children under 6. It extends across the life course and is speaking towards a continuum of care. It's also important to look to guidance to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and in particular the minimum core, which includes the right of access, essential drugs, reproductive, maternal and child health care, immunization, and the prevention, treatment and control of epidemic and endemic diseases. So there is some guidance, and we know that Tony Westwood is hard at work together with COMIC, trying to define what an essential package of care might look like. If we move from the Constitution into legislation and towards the regulations, we need to take a look at the National Health Act and who is eligible for free health services within the public health system. And there we're looking at pregnant and breastfeeding women and children under the age of 6 who are entitled to free health services. It doesn't specify what kind of health services. Simply free health services. And that all persons are entitled to free primary health care services. And that's provided that they are not beneficiaries of a medical aid scheme. And finally, women are entitled to free termination. The Universal Patient Fee Schedule then tries to unpack this in a little bit more detail. It distinguishes between full fee-paying patients and subsidized patients, and it also defines a set of free healthcare services. So if we look at patients, all social grant beneficiaries are entitled to free healthcare services, and this includes refugees and permanent residents if they are grant beneficiaries, and they are now entitled to receive the CSG. And that is something that we should be looking out for and advocating for, because within the Department of Social Development and within SASSA, again, there is resistance and discrimination. All other patients' fees are then set on a sliding scale, and that is based on income and a means test. The Universal Patient Fee Schedule then defines a certain category of patients as full fee-paying patients. That includes your patients covered by medical aids, by the Road Accident Fund, by foreign governments, and it specifically includes all non-South African citizens. So that's the overarching definition of full-paying patients, but it specifically excludes your permanent residents, non-South African citizens who have temporary residence or work permits, and persons who have entered South Africa illegally from SADC states. And those are all entitled to healthcare services on the same basis as South African citizens. So they would be subject to a means test and would then be qualifying for a subsidized service. It's also important to recognize that if illegal entrants from SADC are entitled to this service, it would apply equally to those who have entered the country legally. What's worrying about the Universal Patient Fee Schedule is that it fails to make any mention of refugees. And yet refugees are entitled to full legal protections under the Refugees Act, and that includes the rights to the Constitution, all the constitutional rights that a South African citizen would be entitled to other than the right to vote. What's of concern is that there have been amendments to the Refugee Act, and previously there was a specific article that referred to their right to healthcare services that has been stripped away, which signals government's intentions in some way to close this space. But at the same time, this constitutional principle, the right to the same constitutional rights as South African citizens, remains in place. Then the patient fee schedule goes on to stipulate a number of other services that are free. That includes non-South African pregnant women and children who are entitled to free healthcare, unless they've come to South Africa specifically to seek healthcare services. As Tony mentioned, it explicitly excludes non-South African citizens from primary healthcare services, and it doesn't stipulate any kind of citizen requirement for any of the other free healthcare services that are outlined in the schedule, and that includes treatment for infectious, formidable, and notifiable diseases. It's important to recognize that the only version of the schedule that I've been able to access, despite numerous attempts, is the one dated 2002. I'm not aware of whether there has been an update, but I think as a Child Health Priorities Conference and as practitioners, we should all have access to that information and be able to engage with that process. So as a result, it doesn't say anything about treatment for HIV. It simply refers to testing. And important to recognize that the exclusion of foreign children from primary healthcare services are inconsistent with children's constitutional right to basic healthcare services and the minimum call. There's been a range of case law in recent years that have helped expand foreign children's access to various entitlements, including legal representation and social assistance. So there are possibilities of taking some of these issues to Constitutional Court. And I just wanted to leave you again with this notion of walls, and that there are two ways of looking at this problem. The one is to approach it by building walls, by excluding, by keeping people out, by creating divides and inequality. The second image comes from Korea. It's the border fence between North and South Korea, and it is covered in ribbons that express people's longing to be reunited. So simply to say, or to end with a quote from Robert Frost's poem, "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was likely to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall and that wants it down."